My 5 acres were my refuge, a patchwork of wildflowers and buzzing hives where the world made sense. At the heart of it stood my barn, its red cedar planks weathered but sturdy, each nail driven by my own hands. I'd built it 3 summers ago, a sanctuary for tools, beehive frames, and quiet evenings sketching orchard plans. To me, it was home as much as the house was. But to the HOA across the road, it was a blight, a rustic eyesore that didn't fit their manicured vision of suburban perfection. The trouble began with a fence, though I should have seen the barn complaint coming. Karen Davis, my neighbor to the east, had always eyed my land with a mix of envy and disdain. Her property, part of the HOA's pristine subdivision, ended at a creek we both had rights to per a decades-old easement. I'd never minded sharing, water was for everyone, I figured, but Karen had other ideas. One muggy July morning, I found her directing a crew to sink chain-link posts along the creek, well past her boundary, cutting off my access entirely. I approached, clutching a folder of documents, my deed, the easement agreement, a survey map with crisp, inked lines. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice even, "this fence is on my land. The creek's shared, you can't block it." Her platinum blonde hair glinted as she turned, lips pursed like she'd bitten a lemon. "I know my rights," she snapped. "This creek's a liability, and I'm securing my property." I handed her the survey map, pointing to the boundary line. She didn't look at it, just shoved it back and walked away. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the HOA, stamped with their officious logo. My barn, they claimed, violated their neighborhood theme of modern, neutral-tone structures. They demanded I repaint it to match their approved palette beige, gray, or bust, or remove it entirely. I laughed, then felt my stomach twist. My land wasn't even in their jurisdiction. I'd bought it free of HOA covenants. The barn was fully permitted, its rustic charm a deliberate choice, not a rebellion. But Karen, a vocal HOA board member, had clearly rallied them to her cause. Her fence was a land grab, the barn complaint was personal. I didn't waste time. I hired a lawyer, Elliot, who drafted a cease and desist letter citing zoning laws and my deed's exemptions. I mailed it to the HOA and hand-delivered a copy to Karen, hoping reason would prevail. It didn't. 2 days later, Karen called the sheriff, claiming I was trespassing by harassing her over the fence. Deputy Rogers, a lanky man with a sun-worn face, pulled up in his cruiser, boots crunching on my gravel drive. I handed him my folder, deed, easement, survey, all in order. He skimmed them, then walked to the creek where Karen stood, arms crossed, her fence posts gleaming defiantly. "Ma'am," Rogers said, tipping his hat, "this easement's clear as day. Your fence is on their land, you'll need to move it." Karen's face reddened, but she didn't argue. Rogers turned to me, his voice low. "She's not happy, watch your back." I nodded, grateful for his fairness but uneasy. The crew dismantled the posts that afternoon, and I thought naively that might be the end of it. The barn issue, I figured, would fizzle once the HOA realized they had no authority. But Karen's glare as she watched the fence come down told a different story. Her eyes lingered on my barn, its red silhouette stark against the sunset. I felt a chill, not from the evening air but from the certainty that this was no longer just about a creek. The HOA's letter, Karen's defiance, the way she'd whispered to her crew as they left, it all pointed to something bigger. She wasn't just fighting for a few feet of land. She wanted control, and my barn, a symbol of my independence, was in her crosshairs. That night I sat on my porch, pixel dawsing at my feet, and stared at the barn. It wasn't just wood and nails, it was proof I could build something lasting, something mine. Karen and the HOA could try to tear it down, but I'd fight for every plank. I didn't know then about the bolt cutters, the midnight stakes, or the fraud festering in the HOA's books. But I knew one thing, this spark was about to ignite. 2 weeks after Deputy Rogers sent Karen's fence crew packing, I thought the worst was over. The creek flowed freely again, and my barn still stood, defiant against the HOA's beige dictatorship. But Karen wasn't one to slink away. Her silence felt like the calm before a storm, and when it broke, it hit hard. I came home one evening to a scene that twisted my gut. My wire fence along the creek was cut in 3 places, jagged ends curling like claws. Deep tire marks gouged the mud, leading to my nearest beehive, smashed to splinters, its frames scattered like broken promises. Honey oozed into the grass, a glistening wound. Worst of all, Pixel, my scruffy mutt who trailed me everywhere, limped toward me whimpering. A nail board deliberately placed near the fence line had pierced his paw. I pried it out, cursing under my breath, and rushed him to the vet. Antibiotics and a $200 bill later, I was told to watch for infection. Pixel's pain wasn't just physical, it was a violation of our sanctuary. The barn, thank God, was untouched, but I saw fresh spray paint on its side. HOA rules in neon orange, the same color as the HOA's complaint letters. Karen's message was clear. She'd keep coming until my land, my barn, my life bent to her will. I wasn't just angry, I was done playing nice. This wasn't about a creek anymore, it was war. I ordered 4 motion sensor cameras, the kind that ping your phone every 10 seconds until you mute them. I mounted them strategically, 1 on the barn's eaves, 2 along the creek, 1 by the hives. Next, I called Nora Beltran, a licensed surveyor with a reputation for precision and grit. She arrived at dawn, her boots sinking into the mud as she hammered fluorescent stakes into the ground, marking my property's corners. She stapled laminated placards to each one, bold text warning of criminal penalties for tampering with survey monuments. "Let's see them try," Nora said, her eyes glinting. I liked her already. That night at 1:13 a.m., my phone lit up with alerts. The cameras caught 2 figures in hoodies moving like shadows along the creek. One taller wielded bolt cutters, snapping Nora's stakes with practiced ease. The other, shorter, with platinum blonde hair spilling from her hood, tossed the stakes into the water. Moonlight hit her face, Karen, no question. The taller figure turned, and I froze. His grimace was unmistakable. Chandler, a local troublemaker Deputy Rogers had hauled in before. They didn't touch the barn, but their path took them close, and I saw Chandler glance at it, bolt cutters in hand, like he was sizing it up for later. I called Rogers at first light, emailing him the footage. He didn't need facial recognition software. Chandler's rap sheet was his resume. "That's him all right," Rogers said, watching the video on my porch. "And her." He didn't need to name Karen. By noon, he had a warrant for criminal mischief and trespassing. At dawn the next day, he and 2 deputies knocked on Chandler's door. Body cam footage, which I later saw, showed Chandler in pajama pants, bleary-eyed, insisting he'd been asleep all night. Rogers held up a still from my camera, Chandler mid-snarl, bolt cutters gleaming. Chandler's jaw dropped and he went quiet. Karen's arrest was less theatrical, but just as damning. Rogers searched her garage and found Nora's stakes, still wet from the creek, alongside her laminated placards and a half-empty can of neon orange spray paint, the same shade defacing my barn and my no trespassing signs. Karen claimed Chandler had stored tools there without her knowledge, but Rogers wasn't buying it. Her platinum hair, caught on my camera, was her undoing. Both were cuffed and hauled to county jail. Karen made bond by lunch, her lawyer already spinning excuses. Chandler wasn't so lucky. His 2021 check-kiting conviction meant he was on probation, and this stunt landed him on a no-bond hold pending a revocation hearing. As I scrubbed the paint off my barn, Pixel napping nearby, I felt a grim satisfaction. The cameras, the stakes, Nora's placards, they'd done their job, but I knew Karen. She'd be back, and the HOA's vendetta against my barn wasn't over. I'd need more than cameras to win this fight. With Chandler locked up and Karen out on bond, I thought I'd have a moment to breathe. My barn, freshly scrubbed of her neon orange HOA rules graffiti, stood tall, a quiet rebuke to the HOA's campaign to erase it. But the fight was far from over. Karen's glare as she left the courthouse told me she was plotting her next move, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. What I didn't expect was how deep the rot ran, not just in her schemes, but in the HOA itself. My lawyer, Elliot, a wiry man with a knack for spotting lies, suggested we dig into the HOA's finances. The $3,500 gate Karen had illegally installed on my easement nagged at him. "Gates don't just appear," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Let's follow the money." He subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, and what we found was a bombshell. A cashier's check for the gate, signed by Chandler, had been drawn from the HOA's reserve account, but that was just the start. Chandler, who moonlighted as the HOA's bookkeeper, had written checks totaling $46,900 for grounds improvements that never happened, phantom projects like non-existent flower beds and a gazebo no one had seen. The HOA board, a mix of retirees and busy professionals, was blindsided. They trusted Chandler's ledger entries, never questioning the neon green approved stamps on his invoices. At an emergency meeting, their faces paled as Elliot presented the evidence. They voted unanimously to press charges against Chandler, their shock turning to fury. I sat in the back watching Corinne's absence. She'd resigned from the board the day after her arrest. Her silence felt calculated, like she was distancing herself from the fallout. The investigation escalated when Detective Miriam Page from the county's white-collar crime unit took over. She seized Chandler's home computer, a dusty tower that held a treasure trove of deceit. Forged receipts, fake meeting minutes, and a word template for those neon green stamps painted a clear picture. Chandler had been skimming HOA funds for years. Worse, we found transactions labeled consulting fees funneled into Corinne's personal bank account $12,000 over 2 years, siphoned from the same reserve account. Corinne wasn't just a bully, she was complicit in fraud. I stood outside my barn that evening, Pixel's bandage rustling as he sniffed the grass. The HOA's demand to repaint or remove the barn now felt like a distraction, a way to keep me busy while Corinne and Chandler worked their scam. Every board I'd nailed into that barn was a stake in my independence, and they'd tried to tear it down, figuratively and maybe literally. Cleaning the spray paint had been a small win, but uncovering their scheme felt like reclaiming my land all over again. Corinne lawyered up fast. Her attorney, James Hall, charged $600 an hour and stonewalled every question. She claimed ignorance, insisting Chandler acted alone. But the bank records didn't lie, and neither did my cameras. Those midnight stake-pulling sessions, caught in grainy moonlight, showed her as Chandler's partner, not his pawn. Chandler, meanwhile, was sweating. Facing probation revocation for his 2021 check kiting scheme and new felony charges for theft and fraud, he was desperate. Detective Page offered him a lifeline: testify against Corinne, and the DA might go easier on him. Chandler took the deal. In a taped interview, he admitted Corinne had pushed the Gate project, knowing it violated my easement, and used HOA funds to bankroll it. The consulting fees were her cut, he said, for keeping the board in the dark. He even mentioned the barn, claiming Corinne had riled up the HOA to target it, hoping I'd cave under pressure and sell my land. Hearing that, I felt a surge of vindication. My barn wasn't just a building, it was the line I'd drawn, and they'd crossed it. The HOA sent me a letter, not an apology yet, but a promise to audit their books in tight oversight. It was a start. As I patched a beehive frame, the hum of surviving bees steadying my nerves, I knew these were small wins. Chandler's confession, Corinne's exposure, the HOA's awakening. But small wins build momentum. Corinne was cornered, her schemes unraveling, and I had Elliot Page and a barn that refused to budge. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time I felt the tide turning. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a fitting stage for the final act of my war with Corinne and Chandler. My barn, still standing despite their schemes, felt like a silent witness as I took my seat. The HOA's demand to tear it down, because its red cedar clashed with their beige utopia, had been the spark, but their crimes had fanned the flames. Now, after months of evidence and maneuvering, justice was at hand. Chandler's deal with the DA was the turning point. Facing probation revocation for his 2021 check kiting scheme and new felony charges for theft and fraud, he'd crumbled. The prosecutor offered him a 4-year sentence, parole eligible in 2 if he testified truthfully against Corinne. He took it. In a gray jumpsuit, Chandler looked smaller than the bolt cutter-wielding shadow on my cameras. His voice, steady but low, laid bare Corinne's plot. She orchestrated the land grab, he said, promising him a slice of my property once the HOA annexed it. The illegal gate, the midnight stake pulling, the $46,900 siphoned from HOA funds, all her orders, with Chandler handling the dirty work and forged paperwork. Corinne sat stone-faced, her platinum hair pulled tight, as the prosecutor played my Ring camera footage. The grainy video showed her and Chandler loading rebar into her SUV at 12:47 a.m., the timestamp matching the night Nora's survey stakes vanished. Another clip caught Karen spraying HOA rules on my barn, her movements deliberate, almost gleeful. The jury leaned forward, their faces hardening. My barn wasn't just a building, it was evidence, its weathered planks bearing the scars of her vendetta. I'd scrubbed the paint off, but the memory of that violation fueled my resolve to see this through. The prosecutor's closing was surgical. Karen and Chandler hadn't just trespassed or vandalized, they'd conspired to steal my land, using HOA funds and fake documents to bully me into submission. The barn complaint, she argued, was a tactic to wear me down, to make me sell or comply. This wasn't about aesthetics, she said, pointing to a photo of my barn. It was about control. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts, felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and misdemeanor trespass. Karen's sentencing was swift. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with steel gray hair, revoked her bond. 18 months in prison, $32,000 restitution to me for damages, and $46,900 to the HOA for stolen funds. A 5-year no-contact order would follow her release. Chandler got his 4 years, his testimony sparing him worse. As Karen was led away, I met her eyes. No anger, no triumph, just a polite wave, a gesture of closure. She looked away, her defiance finally broken. Outside, the air felt lighter. Pixel, his paw healed, bounded across my land when I got home, chasing a butterfly toward the barn. I leaned against its door, the cedar warm from the sun, and let the weight of the past months lift. This barn had been my line in the sand, the one thing I wouldn't let them take. Every nail I'd driven into it, every hour spent building it, had been a promise to myself. This land was mine, and I'd fight for it. Now, with Karen behind bars and Chandler's schemes exposed, that promise felt fulfilled. But the victory wasn't just mine. The HOA, shaken by the fraud, was reforming. New board members, untainted by Karen's influence, had started auditing their books. They hadn't dropped the barn complaint yet, but Elliot was confident we'd squash it. My permits were ironclad. I began sketching plans for a greenhouse where Karen's gate once stood, a place for tomato starts and new dreams. The bees, resilient as ever, hummed in their repaired hives, and Pixel's tail wagged like a metronome. As I walked the creek's edge, the same water Karen had tried to claim, I felt a shift. The fight had been brutal, but it had carved out something new, a chance to build, to grow, to reclaim this land not just from her but for myself. The barn stood as proof. I'd held my ground, and now I could start again. Karen's shadow was gone, and the future smelled like fresh earth and possibility. With Karen in prison and Chandler behind bars, the air on my 5 acres felt lighter, like the land itself was exhaling. My barn, its cedar planks free of graffiti, stood as a quiet testament to my victory over the HOA's demand to tear it down. Their neighborhood-themed complaint, meant to erase my rustic haven, had crumbled alongside Karen's schemes. But winning in court was only half the battle. Now it was time to rebuild not just fences, but dreams. The HOA's transformation came first. A new board, untainted by Karen's influence, sent me a letter, not the usual stamped ultimatum, but a genuine apology. Enclosed was a check for $4,500 drawn from Chandler's frozen accounts to repair my vandalized beehives. "We're reviewing all policies," they wrote, "including the complaint against your barn." It wasn't a full retreat, but Elliot, my lawyer, assured me the barn's permits were untouchable. I framed the letter, hanging it inside the barn next to my toolbox, a reminder of how far I'd come. I turned my energy to the land. Where Karen's illegal gate once blocked my creek, I broke ground for a greenhouse. The frame went up fast, its glass panels catching the morning sun like a promise. Inside, I planted tomato starts, their green tips poking through the soil, and basil that scented the air. Each shovel of dirt felt like burying the past, Karen's bolt cutters, her spray paint, her lies. The bees, resilient despite their shattered hive, buzzed stronger than ever, their hum a soundtrack to my renewal. Pixel, his paw fully healed, darted through the fields, chasing dragonflies with a joy that mirrored my own. The barn became my anchor. I'd built it to hold tools and beehive frames, but it held something deeper now. Proof I could weather any storm. Late afternoons, I'd sit on a hay bale inside, sketching orchard plans or just listening to the creek. The HOA's threat to remove it had been a personal attack, not just on my property but on my right to choose how I lived. Keeping it standing unbowed was my quiet rebellion. I touched up its paint, not beige, but a deeper red, a nod to my defiance. The HOA's reform wasn't perfect. Whispers of the barn complaint lingered, and I kept my cameras on, their red lights blinking in the dusk. But the $4,500 let me rebuild the hive stronger, with reinforced frames to protect the bees. I ordered native wildflower seeds to plant along the creek, a gift for the pollinators and a middle finger to Corinne's chain-link legacy. My land wasn't just secure, it was thriving, a patchwork of growth and grit. Pixel and I took long walks, his leash slack as he sniffed the new greenhouse beds. The creek sparkled, no longer contested, its water a shared lifeline again. I felt a rhythm returning, one I hadn't known since before Corinne's fence. The legal fight had drained me, but it had also sharpened my purpose. This land, this barn, these bees, they were mine to nurture, not just defend. Yet a shadow loomed. A letter arrived from Elaine Castor claiming to be Corinne's heir, insisting on a right-of-way across my land. It smelled like another forged deed, another grab at what I'd fought for. Elliot was already on it, pulling survey records to shut it down. I tucked the letter away, refusing to let it dim my progress. The greenhouse smelled of fresh soil, the bees danced, and the barn stood firm. I'd faced worse than Elaine, and I'd face her too. For now, I savored the small victories. A reformed HOA, a thriving hive, a dog who ran free. The barn's shadow stretched long in the evening light, a reminder that I'd built something lasting. Corinne's prison cell was her new boundary, my land was my fresh start. A year after Corinne's conviction, my land felt like mine again. The barn, its red cedar gleaming under fresh paint, stood defiant against the HOA's faded demand to remove it. Their neighborhood theme complaint was a distant memory, buried under court rulings and my ironclad permits. The greenhouse thrived, tomatoes ripening in the sun, and my bees hummed with purpose. But peace, I learned, was never guaranteed. A letter arrived from Elaine Castor, claiming to be Corinne's heir. She demanded a right-of-way across my land, waving a deed that reeked of fraud. My stomach tightened, another grab at what I'd fought for. Elliot, my lawyer, was ready. We pulled Nora's survey records and my title documents, proving the deed was a fake. Elaine withdrew her claim before the court hearing, her bluff called. I stood by the barn, Pixel at my heels, and felt the weight of that victory. This barn wasn't just wood, it was my anchor, proof I could outlast any threat. Restitution checks began trickling in from the state's crime victim fund, Corinne's prison wages garnished at $58 a month. It would take decades to cover the $32,000 she owed me, but each check was a small triumph, a reminder of her defeat. I used the first to buy more wildflower seeds, planting them along the creek she'd tried to steal. The bees loved them, and so did I. Then came a surprise, a letter from Chandler postmarked from prison. He'd earned a paralegal certificate and wrote to apologize. I was wrong, he said, his handwriting shaky. I hurt you in your land. Enclosed was a hand-drawn map suggesting spots for an orchard near my barn. It was a gesture, not a debt cleared, but it moved me. I wrote back, no promises, just a note. The sunflowers by the barn are taller than ever. Keep learning. Redemption wasn't my call, but I could acknowledge his try. The barn cast a long shadow as I walked the land, Pixel chasing butterflies. The HOA's reformed board had dropped their complaint, and my cameras, still vigilant, caught only deer now. The creek flowed free, the greenhouse bloomed, and the bees danced. Elaine's failed claim was a final echo of Corinne's greed, but it couldn't touch what I'd built. The barn stood as my testament, every nail a refusal to bend. Spring brought new growth. The wildflowers exploded in color, and the sunflowers nodded toward the barn, their height a quiet boast. Corinne's prison wages, Chandler's letter, Elaine's retreat, they closed a circle, turning conflict into something fertile. I leaned against the barn, its warmth steadying me, and knew this land was more than mine. It was a story of holding fast, of roots deeper than any deed. Spring painted my land in wildflower hues, the barn's red cedar glowing against the green. The HOA's demand to remove it, a petty jab at its unapproved, rustic charm, was a faded threat, silenced by court victories and my unyielding permits. Corinne's schemes, her fence, her fraud, her graffiti were history, but the final twist of justice was sweeter than my bees' honey. Her land, once a battleground, was now a garden for all. Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit, bought Corinne's property after her conviction. They reached out, inviting me to consult on planting native pollinators. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had wielded HOA rules like a club, trying to control my barn, my creek, my life. Now her lawn, manicured to HOA standards, would bloom for the community she'd bullied. I agreed to help, not for her, but for the land itself. The first volunteer day was a revelation. I loaned Sprout Tomorrow my brush cutter, its blade chewing through Karen's pristine grass. Deputy Rogers showed up, trading his badge for a shovel, his grin wide as he hauled compost. New HOA members, free of Karen's shadow, joined in, their hands dirty but spirits light. We built raised beds, sowed tomato vines, and planted lavender for my bees. The air buzzed with laughter and earth, a stark contrast to the midnight clatter of Karen's bolt cutters. My barn loomed nearby, its silhouette a quiet sentinel, watching the land it had helped save transform. By noon, Karen's lawn was gone. In its place, neat rows of seedlings promised squash, peppers, and herbs. The tomato vines, still fragile, curled toward the sun, echoing the greenhouse I'd built where her gate once stood. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, and looked at the barn. Its planks bore no trace of her spray paint, but they held my story, every nail a defiance of her greed. Keeping it standing had been my fight. Seeing this garden rise felt like my reward. Rogers clapped my shoulder. "Hell of a change, huh?" he said, nodding toward the beds. I smiled. She'd hate this. We laughed, the sound mingling with the clink of trowels. The HOA volunteers, once complicit in Karen's barn complaint, now apologized with their work, their shovels turning her legacy into something alive. Sprout Tomorrow's director thanked me, but I just pointed to the barn. "That's what kept me going," I said. They nodded, understanding. The day ended with cold lemonade and plans for a harvest dinner. As I walked home, Pixel bounding ahead, the barn's shadow stretched across the creek. Karen's land, once a symbol of control, was now a shared victory. My bees would pollinate its flowers, my greenhouse would supply its starters, and my barn would watch over it all. The fight had been brutal, fences cut, hives smashed, Pixel's pain, but it had forged this. A community, a garden, a full circle. I leaned against the barn, its warmth grounding me. Karen was in a cell, her HOA reign ended. My land, my barn, my life, they were mine, not just in law but in spirit. This was the final victory, not just surviving but thriving, with roots deeper than any deed. October's golden light bathed my land as Sprout Tomorrow hosted a harvest dinner on Karen's former property. The barn, my red cedar beacon, stood firm, its HOA critics silenced by permits and justice. The tables groaned with dishes, roasted butternut squash, garlic honey carrots, heirloom tomato bruschetta, all grown where Karen's lawn once mocked my wildflowers. Neighbors laughed, their plates piled high, the air thick with gratitude. I'd built a new barn, permitted and proud, using reclaimed wood from Karen's old shed, a poetic twist. Its beams held no trace of her HOA rules graffiti, only the strength of my resolve. The old barn still stood, now a workshop for beehive frames, its scars a badge of survival. The HOA's demand to remove it felt like a bad dream, erased by my victory and this new structure, a testament to moving forward. Pixel darted through the fields, his paw long-heeled, chasing scents with reckless joy. I watched him, my heart full. The fight, Karen's fence, her fraud, the nailboard that hurt him, had forged this peace. Sprout Tomorrow's director raised a glass to me, but I shrugged. "The barn kept me grounded," I said, nodding.